The simple agreement for future equity has been a very popular investment tool for early stage startups for the last several years. But in 2018, Y Combinator updated it and made some pretty significant changes. We'll explain how the new SAFE works in this video. Hi, I'm Steve Morris, and I use this Startup SOS channel to provide practical how-to advice for first-time entrepreneurs. So the topic today, the new SAFE based on post-money valuation. So as we said in the previous video on the original SAFE, the SAFE is a convertible security, and that part didn't change. It's a way for an investor to provide funding to a startup with a relatively simple legal document and put off until the future the conversion of that money into ownership of the company. So hence a convertible security, money that later converts into stock, into ownership in the company. So why update the SAFE in 2018? Well, a couple reasons. First of all, SAFE investments were getting bigger and bigger. Companies were raising a lot of money with a SAFE, and it became more reasonable to think of the SAFE as a round in and of itself, or actually a series of SAFEs. So that was part of the thought process. Part of what came along with that amount of money being raised as SAFEs was it became difficult for investors to understand really how much of a company, what percent of the ownership were they getting. And it became difficult for startups to get a good view of how much dilution they were getting because of all of this money they were taking in the form of a SAFE. So the update was meant to address both of those issues. So what didn't change in the SAFE? Well, one thing that didn't change was what causes the conversion from the SAFE dollars into ownership, and that's an equity investment of any size, just like before in the original SAFE. And like the original SAFE, no interest rate and no maturity date. So the two big things that make it very different from a convertible note. The other thing that didn't change is the SAFE comes in 4 versions. The first, or standard version, has a valuation cap but no discount. The second has a discount but no valuation cap. The third has both a valuation cap and a discount. And then the fourth, like the original SAFE, has no valuation cap, no discount, but an MFN, a most favored nation clause. Now, to understand discounts and the MFN, you might check out the previous video on the SAFE because those work the same way. There's a link right up at the top of the screen to that previous video. What did change? Boy, I think the number one biggest change was that the valuation cap on the new SAFE is based on post-money value, not pre-money value. The original SAFE, it was pre-money, just like a convertible note. This is post-money, and we'll try to explain what the heck does that mean. A couple of other changes. Pro-rata rights now are optional. The other change actually with the pro-rata rights is that for the new SAFE, the pro-rata rights, the right to purchase more shares, to maintain a percent ownership, only applies to that first round of equity, the one that causes the SAFE to convert. The other thing that's different with the SAFE is there's language in it now that says thou shalt not modify these terms. Y Combinator really wants you to use one of the 4 versions of the SAFE as written. Now, there's no legal constraint, of course, on doing that. People can certainly modify the legal documents however they want, but the intent of Y Combinator is that you use one of the 4 versions as is. What does this mean to have a SAFE based on the post-money cap? Well, think of the SAFE as being a round in and of itself. In fact, it's a little more general than that. Think of the convertible securities that you use to raise money as being around in and of themselves. That would be the SAFE vehicles, but you might also do, say, a convertible note, another convertible type of security. So think of those combined together as being around in and of themselves. The post-money cap relates to a cap on the post-money value of that round of convertible securities, not on the round of the equity investment that causes that SAFE and other convertible security money to convert into ownership. And I think the best way to explain that is probably to walk through an example. So let's say we have a startup that has a cap table, in other words, an ownership, a stock ownership table that looks something like this. You got the founders owning most of the company, except for 750,000 shares that are allocated for options. And so the total number of shares either owned or allocated is 10 million. And now, let's say we go out and raise some safe investment dollars. So investor A, to start with, provides $200,000 in safe funding with an agreement that there's a $4 million post-money valuation. $200,000 is 5% of $4 million. So what the company is committing to that investor is that in this round of safe investment, that investor is going to get at least 5% ownership in the company with that $200,000 investment. Later, the company does another investment round with investor B, and investor B invests $800,000. And the company has made more headway, so they've set a higher post-money valuation cap of $8 million. Well, $800,000 is 10% of $8 million. So the commitment the company is making to this investor is that for the $800,000, that investor will get at least 10% of the company. Since the investor is investing so much, the company is making one other commitment, which is the investor has the right to purchase additional shares in the equity round to maintain that 10% ownership. That would be the pro-rata right. So that's our round of safe funding. What does that mean in terms of stock? Well, so far, the company has committed 15% ownership to two safe investors, both of whom got different terms. So now let's say there's an equity round of investment and the company's offered a $5 million investment with a $15 million pre-money valuation. Well, the post-money cap on those two investments, both of those were lower than the pre-money value of this upcoming round. We'll call it a Series A. So definitely we'll have the safe preferred shares kicking in to provide a lower price for those safe investors. Here's how you figure that out. So the company has 10 million fully diluted shares between what the founders have and the shares that are either committed to or actually provided to employees or others in the form of stock options. So a total of 10 million shares. And they've made a commitment to 15% ownership to these two investors. So how much stock will they have to issue in order to have stock to provide to those investors and have them own 15%? Well, the total stock that they need times 0.85 has to be equal to 10 million. So that the 10 million is 85% of the ownership. That leaves 15% ownership for the safe investors. Well, do the math. You divide 0.85 into 10 million, and what you get is about 11.7 million shares of stock. That's what they'll need to have about 1.7 million shares to issue to those investors. And again, do the math. That means that the two investors will own 15% of the company. So that you can think of as the safe round. That's the calculation that you do just immediately before doing the next calculation for the equity conversion. But before we look at the equity numbers, let's ask, what are our safe investors paying for their stock? Well, start with the investor A, the first investor who paid $200,000 and received 588,000 shares of stock. Do the division, and that investor paid about 34 cents per share. The later investor invested more, but in a higher post-money valuation, received about 1.1 million shares. So do the math again, and that investor paid 68 cents for each share of stock. So before we move ahead and look at the impact of the equity investment, let's take a look at our safe preferred cap table. In other words, the ownership of the company once you take all of the safe conversions into account. So the founders still have their 9.25 million shares. Investor A received 588,235 shares, and investor B has just over 1.1 million shares. Again, the option pool is still sitting there at 750,000, so we're at our 11,764,706 shares. And then we do the numbers for the equity investment. So if you recall, it was a $15 million pre-money valuation that the Series A investors gave to the company. But beyond that, the Series A investors did something that often happens, which is they're requiring the company to allocate additional shares of stock for the option pool, because the investors want to make sure that there's stock available in the form of options for the employees, for compensating the employees that the company is going to have to bring on board. So again, a very, very common requirement. So now, in addition to the 11 million shares outstanding, which included the addition for the safe money, they now have these additional shares allocated for options, so a total fully diluted capitalization of about 13.5 million shares of stock. Now that we know the fully diluted number of shares of stock, we can calculate the stock price. It's simply the pre-money value divided by the number of shares. Do that math, and it's just a little bit over $1.11 per share. So now the question is, how many shares of stock, of additional stock, will a company have to issue in order to have enough stock such that they can sell it to these new investors for $5 million? Well, again, do the math, and it comes out that they'll need just over 4.4 million shares of stock to have enough at $1.11 to raise that $5 million. We'll call the lead investor C. They're going to provide $4 million of that money. Remember, investor B has a pro-rata right, so we're going to assume that investor B will buy more stock to maintain their investment percentage, and there'll be some other miscellaneous investors that make up the difference for the total of $5 million. So what does the cap table look like after the Series A investment? Well, the founders still have their 9.25 million shares, and investor A still has the 588,000 shares that they had. Investor B has exercised their pro-rata right. So they had just a little over 1.1 million shares. Now they have a little over 1.6 million. Now, investor C, the equity investor in this new round, owns 20%, just over 3.5 million shares of stock. The other investors come in and invest in the rest of the stock to round out to $5 million. And the option pool now that's both allocated as well as committed is, of course, a lot bigger now because of the additional shares that the investor C required that the company issue prior to this round. So now the total capitalization is just over 17.9 million shares of stock, fully diluted, i.e. counting both the shares actually issued as well as everything in the option pool. The ownership of the founders, as you can see, is down, getting pretty close to 50%. The investor A, who in the preferred round had 5%, is down to 3.3. Investor B, who in the preferred round was committed 10%, is now down to 9.1. If you look at the actual issued stock, not counting the allocated but not awarded options, they are indeed at 10%. Of course, investor C is at 20% because they invested $4 million in a round that was 15 million pre with a $5 million investment, 20 million post-investment, and of course $4 million is 20% of that 20 million, so they're at 20%. And then you can see where the rest of the numbers fall out. So hopefully that helps you understand a little bit better the process of determining the number of shares that have to be issued to provide the shares for the safe investors, which then lets you calculate the price they're paying. Then you add in the new options that the equity investors are requiring, and then you can calculate the share value of the stock for the equity investors, and then finally determine how many shares of stock have to be issued in order to have enough stock to cover that, in this case, $5 million investment. So the safe preferred is the type of stock that's going to be issued to the safe investors if they're paying less for the stock in that equity, in that conversion round, than the Series A or the equity investors. And that will happen if a discount kicks in or if their cap kicks in to result in them paying less. Now, if there's no discount and if the post-money cap ends up being lower than the pre-money valuation in the round, then there is no difference in the price, and the safe investors actually convert their funds into the same preferred shares as the Series A investors. So the safe preferred only happens if the safe investors pay less for their stock than was paid for by the equity investors in the round that converted the SAFE. And of course, same as is the case for the original SAFE, the difference in the SAFE preferred is the liquidation preference, the conversion price, and the dividend rate. And we went through an example of how that works in the previous video. And again, there's a link to that right up there. What are the advantages of this new version of the SAFE? Well, of course, it has a lot of the same advantages as the original SAFE. It delays the valuation, so your funds convert to stock in the future when hopefully you're worth more than you're reducing your dilution. It's a very simple legal document, certainly compared to the typical priced round, which is much more complex, and that makes it low cost from a legal point of view and relatively simple to negotiate. So a more practical way of raising money than a priced round, certainly for an early stage funding round. You can do multiple closes with the SAFE with as in our example, different terms for different investors. That's a lot easier to do than with a priced round where there's more coordination. No interest rate, no maturity date, so that's an attraction compared to a convertible note. And the other benefit, the big benefit compared to the original SAFE, is just more transparency. Transparency for the investors as to what percent of the company they're getting. Transparencies for the entrepreneurs about how much dilution they're taking on in order to close these SAFE dollars. So what are the drawbacks? Well, it's maybe a little more complex than the original SAFE because you have to go through a couple of steps to calculate, the amount of SAFE stock that's going to be issued and then calculate the Series A. But I would say the big drawback is really the dilution hit. You're in this version of the SAFE, you're guaranteeing a minimum percent ownership to the SAFE investors. And that guarantee is going to reduce the ownership of the founders because that's the only other place for that stock to come from. So compared to looking at pre-money value from the original SAFE, the founders can end up with a little bit less ownership. On the other hand, it's a big attraction for the investors because the investors have a much clearer idea of what percent they're getting for their investment in the company. And that makes it more attractive to them, which maybe makes it a little bit easier to close around. So that's a good thing for the entrepreneur. So that's a quick overview of the simple agreement for future equity, the new version 2018 based on the post-money valuation. If that was helpful, please click like and share it with other entrepreneurs. If you haven't subscribed yet, please click the subscribe button down in the corner. And if you have any questions, please leave a comment. I'll certainly try to answer any questions that you have. And keep in mind, we have one more coming up in this series on the Series Seed, which is a priced equity round using a standardized set of documents. So when you click on that subscribe button, think about clicking the bell too, and you'll get a notification when that video becomes available. That's it for now. Thank you very much for watching.